Smoke from Canadian wildfires has left the northeast U.S. engulfed in a thick haze, pushing New York City to the top of the list of global cities with the worst air pollution on Tuesday. The FAA briefly issuing a ground stop at New York's LaGuardia Airport, with many schools and towns canceling outdoor activities for kids. So we wanted to know the real health impact. Joining us to discuss is Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA Commissioner and a CNBC contributor. It's good to see you again, Dr. Gottlieb. And is this just, any exposure at the time you want to try to minimize, or could exposure create, problems down the road?
You certainly want to minimize exposure. Right now, the air quality index in New York City is about 220. Oftentimes in California, when they experience fires out there, they'll reach in the 300s. And so this isn't unprecedented. It's about equivalent to what you would see in a smog-filled city like New Delhi or Jakarta or Beijing at times. A lot of the impacts we know are short-term. People who have pre-existing health conditions, cardiovascular disease, respiratory conditions, those could be exacerbated by exposure to the smoke, and those individuals should try to limit their time outside. Wear a high-quality mask, a KN95 or N95 mask can reduce the impact of the smoke. There's not as much that we know about the longer-term impacts of exposure. There's some data, some literature from studies that have been done in California showing that there could be some risk of, for example, to pregnant women, the risk of premature delivery. A lot of those studies are speculative. They're not really definitive. So we don't really know a lot about the longer-term impacts to people who don't have pre-existing health conditions that could be exacerbated by exposure to smoke.
Right. And I'd have to imagine that any problems like you mentioned would be from, direct exposure for long periods of time versus this?
Well, we're talking about short-term exposure. Are there long-term impacts from short-term exposure? Because this is going to be a short-term exposure. And that's where we don't have as much data, that there are long-term impacts. Again, there are some studies that have been done in California that showed, for example, some spirometry reductions in people a year out from short-term exposure over the course of a week, for example. But there's been very few studies that have looked at that. And I think for most individuals, what they should be concerned about is going outside, exposing themselves for extended periods of time outside. So it's not a good time to be outdoors exercising, for example. If you have health conditions, if you have respiratory conditions, cardiovascular disease, probably emergency room visits will be up because people who do have pre-existing health conditions who are exposed to the smoke outside will have some impact from it. But for most individuals who can limit their exposure, there really shouldn't be any long-term impacts from this episode.
And the people who should limit their exposure would be people with pre-existing respiratory conditions, asthma, maybe people above a certain age with compromised breathing and so forth. Those are the people who are most at risk here, right?
And younger individuals, small children, because their airways are more susceptible to the impacts of smoke. I think everyone should try to limit their exposure. Obviously, not everyone can, but this isn't a good time to be outdoors jogging, riding a bike. This is going to be hopefully temporary. It's a couple of days. It might extend into Friday. We'll see how it goes into next week. And so to the extent that you can limit your time outside and
close your windows. Close your windows.
Close your windows. People who have central air are in a better position because they can filter their central air. People who receive their air from an air conditioning unit in the window, it's going to suck in some of the contaminated air. It's harder to filter. In those circumstances, you should try to create a room inside. Maybe if you have a HEPA filter, a room that's more filtered. For example, a bedroom, you might move a filtration unit into that room. Not everyone can do that. The other thing people recommend is trying to reduce reductions in air quality indoors. So it's not a good time to be smoking indoors or lighting candles, doing things that might contribute. You have a substantial reduction on the smoke that gets into a home on the order of 30 to 40%, but some of this smoke will still get into households.
Dr. Gottlieb, I want to ask you about Merck's lawsuit against the government over the Inflation Reduction Act, which they're saying is unconstitutional. What if they're right? What are the consequences? And are you surprised that they have taken this to such a level?
I'm not surprised that there's going to be litigation. There'll probably be other lawsuits filed. Look, there's a lot of components of this legislation that really create questions of whether or not the companies are being afforded due process. For example, it was the mechanism for setting the prices was explicitly exempted from judicial review. The agency, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, doesn't need to go through notice and comment rulemaking like they would for any other regulatory process. They even put out a guidance saying that the companies, when they go into purportedly negotiate the price with the agency, and I really think the agency will be setting the price, but when they go in for those discussions, the documents that get created as part of those discussions need to be destroyed. And so that's an indication that CMS, the government, doesn't want to be bound by prior precedents. They don't want companies coming in and saying, well, you did this last time, so you've got to destroy your documents and you can't talk publicly about the context of those negotiations. So that raises real questions of whether or not due process is being afforded to these companies. And that's the basis of this and other lawsuits I think you're going to see.